Recording. All right, everybody. Thank you, and thank you for joining me. Welcome to the presentation. Today, we're going to be talking about the Office of Career Strategies Resumes Workshop. We want to help you best understand how to leverage your professional and academic experience in the context of a professional resume. Today, we're going to talk about some of the basic ways by which we would go about constructing the resume, writing the resume, and we will not touch as much on the distinctive differences between this and the academic CV. That's something for a different presentation, although I'm happy to touch on those areas if questions arise or if you have anything to add. As you likely determined by now, I'm a solo operator today, so if you have questions, I invite you to ask them as I'm presenting or put time at the end. You're also welcome to put them in the chat. I will be unable to reference the chat until the end of the presentation, however, so just to let you know, in case you have an immediate question, feel free to just interrupt. I take no offense. Today's session is also for a broad audience. We've invited master's students, PhD students, and postdocs to today's presentation. Some of you have likely had drafts of resumes already prepared. Some of you have never thought about a professional resume before. So I thought it'd be best to kind of just bring everyone into one big space. The samples that you'll see today are very simple, straightforward, and stripped down samples. They are samples that I would probably say are more appropriate for a master's student or an individual who is seeking a one-page resume. Postdocs and PhD students have the luxury of usually being able to, with rare exceptions, provide a longer document. Their professional resume can sometimes be 2 pages, even 3. We recommend 2 is kind of helpful. But rather than like drag you in with all the length of these documents and samples, I thought we would just go with something that was a little bit more straightforward so you can get the basic setup of what it's supposed to look like in terms of aesthetics, in terms of the purpose and premise of how we're going to go about writing this, and then we can talk about sort of more nuance in the Q&A portion. So I just wanted to acknowledge that in case you're like, why is he talking about this and why is this one page? So just to clarify that. And so without further ado, let's dive in. All right, that's me. Here we are. So we're going to talk and start about basic approaches. We're going to provide you with some examples. We're going to try to get a little bit more sense of how we're breaking this document down and how we're going to then flesh out particular experiences to showcase evidence of skill. That is ultimately one of those major departures between an academic CV and a professional resume. The professional resume is rooted in the development of skill over the course of time. I feel as though an academic CV, amongst many other things, best articulates achievement and accomplishment in terms of end result. I presented at these conferences, I published in these articles, I published these articles in these publications, therefore I am good. And I know that oversimplifies the academic CV. However, we want to think about more nuance rooted in the professional resume in terms of evidence of skill over time. And that involves a little bit more thinking, a little bit more creative writing, obviously. And that's usually where a lot of folks hang-ups lie. I before this session came from 7 half-hour resume reviews in a row that I did back to back from 8 a.m. until now. I'm just a lot of coffee today. And I will tell you that every resume review that I conducted, and this is persistent amongst all of my resume reviews, they all touch on the need to better exemplify the utilization of skill. So there's a universal need. It is one of the hangups of the document. If you find yourself frustrated by that, my point is join the crowd and we're going to get through it together and walk through that today. Okay. All right. So let's think about what we're actually trying to do here in the context of what this document is, what it looks like, and what it's supposed to be, what its functionality is supposed to be. So some of the real basic stuff, and again, you'll look at samples, you can look at samples all day long, and I don't pretend you can't look those up or you haven't already begun to investigate those, but we want to think about some basic sections. And these sections would be in some line of logic in terms of prioritization. So you will begin and start with your education experience. That is going to be a much briefer section than you would be likely accustomed to in an academic CV. You would then move on to your experience sections, and here I have identified two types of experience sections. And again, academic CVs love to break this down. It'll be jobs and internships and teaching, and volunteer and extracurriculars and on and on and on. We're really only going to break it down into two sections. These two sections, instead of being rooted in what type or what type of experience was it in terms of where did it occur or what is the category of it, it instead will be more broadly categorized by the type of skill being exhibited. And for lack of a better term, I've broken that down into two very broad buckets, as I call them, a technical bucket and a transferable bucket. So what we deem as technical in this context can be research, it can be writing, it can be if your background is engineering, it can be rooted in your ability as an engineer. If your background is neuroscience, it can be rooted in your background as a neuroscientist. It can be rooted in whatever your specificity is. So when I work with humanists, they'll sometimes cringe at the notion of a technical section, and I don't mean it technical in like robotics and technology. It is more just in the nuanced aspect of what you do. So if you are a humanist and your knack is research, then that research is unto itself your technical area of expertise. Transferable experience is much more broad and touches on what are, for lack of a better term, referred to as soft skills, right? So soft skills are seen as leadership skills, management skills, communication skills, operational skills, project management, on and on and on. These are necessary, and they sometimes present themselves outside of the areas of our technical expertise. So if you're a member of the salsa dancing club at Yale, you are exhibiting transferable skills via that experience, I assure you. If you have taught a class here at Yale and you have no interest in teaching classes ever again, I assure you that experience is not for nothing. You are going to be able to utilize that experience to evidence your leadership skills, right? And that's a common conversation I have with people, sort of like convincing them, right, frankly, that their teaching experience is the exhibition of leadership skills. So we want to think more broadly about what those things are, but it allows for a home for every experience that we possess. So we start with education, we go into our two experience sections. Then we'll bring in publications or presentations. The asterisk is if they are necessary, if we deem them necessary. It's sometimes a truncated version of that. So you'll also see something like selected publications and presentations. And then you maybe like in parentheses identify that I'm offering you 3 out of the 20 that I have. Phenomenal. There's more where that came from. Then you would bring in additional skills. These are things like foreign language proficiency, a sort of generic breakdown of technical skills. Are you Mac proficient? Do you know how to use SPSS software? Something along those lines. And then depending on the industry, we identify or denote personal interests. So employers do like to know a little bit about you as a human being. I like to think that a lot of the transferable experience that we identify is an opportunity to help display that personality. But just in case, you have that interest section as well. It's a very pithy portion of the resume. So what do we do with format? We really recommend you stay away from templates. I think that the knack for the template is that you will write to that template. So you get to the bottom of the template, you're like, I'm all done, never mind, congratulations, me, good job, this is all set. And realistically, that is potentially erroneous because it risks us leaving out important information. And so for now, especially at the beginning of this, if you're just starting the development of this document, really just get into the mode of opening up your brain and reflecting on your prior experiences. Within each experience, you are going to have what we call accomplishment statements. Accomplishment statements are the articulation of what you actually did and what you achieved in the role. Those statements are not full sentences. They should not have pronouns of any sort. You are going to be speaking in these phrases that begin with an action verb. The action verb at the start of the statement is sort of the embodiment of what skill you are trying to convey through that little bit of storytelling. As I mentioned, no first person point of view, so we're not having those pronouns anywhere on the document. No I's, no me's, none of that. You want to accentuate content sparingly, which means the usage of bold and italics and bullets, those are good, but it's all about aesthetic appeal. So we want to use those to help bring attention, right? You've heard a lot, and we'll talk about this again, is you've heard the horror stories of a resume and that someone will look at it for 30 seconds. And I think it's worth assuming that's true, if only because it will force you to be very purposeful about what you choose to include and how you choose to present it in the context of aesthetics. So things like bolding and italics and capitalizations, these will help draw the eye, but you want to make sure that you help draw the eye tastefully. And so it's something of a less is more approach, but again, that's what we're here to happily work with you on. Font size is always a matter of contention, especially for those that are having, you know, the long resume and they think they're like done with it, and they're just like, let me just make it down to 8.5 font, and we'll just cram this all into 2 pages and go home. Realistically, you want to look at a 10 to 12 point font size. If you're using like 10-point font Times New Roman, you know how small that really is. So you really want to make sure that you're writing as efficiently as you can. Small font is not an excuse to just, you know, go on and pontificate. Margins are sort of the same game. We really want to try to have no less than a 1/2-inch margin all around. I've seen some people really push that to the limits. And you may think, like, why would I need this anymore? Because we're not printing resumes out as often as we had, especially right now. But, you know, a lot of this is all done, you know, virtually and electronically. And I don't think, I think it's a valid point, but I've seen folks, when I used to do these appointments in person, I would print them out because I'd scribble all over them. And I would print them out, and some people, it would just like kick to the second page and they had no idea. And a lot of that really is sort of like the culmination of your effort. So it's good to know what it does look like, aesthetically speaking, as a printed document. Because you don't want to make that assumption, oh, they'll never do that, and this is the one time they did. It's just nice to be careful and cautious. So now we have these 2 big sections that I already talked about, the experience sections up above. And that word experience, I think it requires a definition. Let's define our terms. We want to think about the roles that we had over the course of time. And we also need to think about what that course of time is. What are the limits of that course of time? And this is different for the different groups that I and my colleagues work with. You know, for the master's students in the audience, you know, you can definitely go as far back. If you're coming from an undergraduate program into a master's program, you could go as far back as junior year. And I don't think anyone's going to worry about that. If you are a PhD and you went right in from an undergraduate program, let's say, maybe you go back to senior year, but I would maybe think that it'd be best to start from the beginning of your time as a PhD student. That's if you're at the end of your tenure as a PhD. If you're currently a PhD student and maybe your 2nd or 3rd year, yeah, you're obviously going to go a couple of years prior to the start of your tenure as a PhD. And postdocs, obviously, you probably want to go back to the start of your PhD tenure as well. So it's all sort of eye of the beholder. I don't want to try to eliminate anything from anyone, because someone may have had just this phenomenal experience in their lives and they really want to talk about it. And I think if it's relevant, then it's worth considering. Now, what constitutes an experience is another valid question. And I think people oversell that term as having some bombastic capacity. That it needs to be this like long tenured, you know, really highly involved experience where you have a couple of references. And look, those are great. I would think we should all aspire for those. But I think we all learn and go through our experience as a student very differently. And I think that needs to be celebrated. So especially in the context of where we are right now, especially with graduate students and postdocs, short-term experiences have become something of, have become somewhat in vogue. And so therefore, it's important to understand and appreciate what experiences actually are. So for example, when I work with PhD students, just to use them as an example, I'll say, well, you do research for your dissertation, that's one experience. You teach a class, that's a second experience. Let's say you set up a colloquium for your department, that's a third experience. Let's say you also do research with a different professor for a different independent project, that's a fourth experience. Maybe you volunteer in your community, that's a fifth experience. Those are 5 separate experiences. Some students, especially, you know, again, this hypothetical PhD student, be like, well, I have one experience. It's me as a PhD where I did these 5 things. They are 5 separate experiences. They evoke different skill sets. They happen at different times. So we want to appreciate that. And it'll help you realize how much you actually have to talk about. And I'd rather have you have that bad problem of realizing like, wow, I have so much to discuss. That will allow for you to be more selective of what makes that 1 or 2 pages. You get to be selected, you get to be the editor here, right? So you don't have to include everything just because you did it. You want to include it, again, because it bears relevance to the job you're aspiring towards. The conversation you're trying to have is to advocate for yourself in your candidacy. That advocacy is all about tying yourself to the job, relating yourself to the job, and trying to say, you're looking for someone with X, Y, and Z skill set. Let me tell you how I've evidenced X, Y, and Z in my past. Okay? So as a result of, well, to get towards that result and to achieve the goal that we're looking for, we want to make sure that we're consistent in our presentation in terms of aesthetic, and we're also accurate in terms of how we're conveying our experiences. Now, accuracy is a funny thing, and I say that not because there's a lot of leeway here of what is accurate. You know, truth is truth. But I think that people tend to be terribly modest, especially those of you in academia. You know, it's a lot of we versus I when you work with others in a collaborative environment, which is good. Like, I want to make that clear. Modesty is also good for, you know, the human race. But when it comes to writing your resume and advocating for yourself, that tendency towards modesty gets in the way of our own advocacy. It precludes us from presenting the honest truth about ourselves, because people understandably think that there's modesty and there's arrogance, and it's just this dyad of behavior. And if I'm not modest, then I am inherently, you know, I'm being bad, I'm being arrogant. Nobody wants to be arrogant. And I always tell folks that it is, instead of this dyad, it is more of a spectrum. And that we want to look at modesty on one end of that spectrum, we look at arrogance on the other end of that spectrum, but rooted in the middle of that spectrum is confidence. And what we're trying to do is find and sort of gestate that confidence. We're building it within us. Some of us don't walk around confident about all, you know, I joke with people, like, you don't go home from the lab one day, kick your feet up and be like, wow, I really nailed it today, me, like, good job. And you go to sleep and do it all over again the next day. That usually doesn't happen. People don't have the luxury of that kind of time, and people don't usually reflect in that capacity. But for this document, this exercise, it really requires that type of reflection and that willingness to identify your accomplishments and achievements where they have occurred. But we have to kind of know what we're looking for. And so that's why this sort of takes place over the course of several edits, because realistically, we're not always walking around, you know, with a strut, super confident about what we're doing, nice and tall. We need to kind of develop this over time, particularly in a professional context, if we're trying to appeal to something that's new or something that is not exactly a short line A to B fit, because most of our experiences are versatile. And most of what I do as far as my profession is to help people understand the versatility of their experiences. But that versatility doesn't always come so easily. And I think people can sometimes get a little concerned or apprehensive or anxious about, am I doing this right? Am I making the case? Am I making a good, am I advocating for myself appropriately? And so this building of confidence is something that we really want to be channeled in on, because we want to see it over the course of time. But it does take time. Again, in terms of basic aesthetics, we want to make sure that the resume is visually appealing, easy on the eyes. We avoid abbreviations, slang, irrelevant lingo. That slang also constitutes your own academic area of expertise. If you are this, you know, deep dive expert in your field about cloning mice, and or doing something with, you know, mice in your research, and you're applying a job where they would never think about cloning mice or utilizing mice, and all I learn about is cloning mice, we're going to have some problems, right? I had a student who worked for our office once, and I was helping her with a resume. I learned more about zebrafish by reading her resume than I ever thought I would ever learn. And she wanted to go into management consulting. And so, you know, I said, why does management consulting never need to know anything about zebrafish? Like, I do need to know about your research, and I need to know about the nature of your work and your analytical and quantitative background, but we may not need to focus on this specific element of your expertise in your research. And that comes as a hard sell too, because that can be very jarring. That's been everything that I did for the last 6 years, let's say. And so we do need to become comfortable with that, and that comes over time. All right, so delving in. Here's an example of a resume. This is the nice, easy, clean sample. You can see the education section at the top, nice and straightforward, really kind of bare but clear. You then see the technical experience section, research and advocacy. And again, you can have 2 adjectives there, that's fine. One's usually sufficient, but research and advocacy is what they chose. And you can see that the positions that follow are of relevance to that category. Then you have your second section, leadership and mentoring. And you see two experiences that would articulate those skill categories in a more transferable context. And then at the bottom, you see the skills section, which includes foreign language competencies, the computer skills we talked about before. This individual left off the interest, which is fine. But you see the bare basics here. Now, if anyone is so inclined and comfortable, and this isn't like a trick, this isn't like some hidden eye thing where there's a bunch of problems rooted in here, but resumes are terribly subjective. So I'm wondering, does anyone have any questions of what they see, or is anything they see that stands out to them in terms of what they like about it or what they don't like about it, or what is like I know I probably need this, but I don't really want to, I don't like this part of it. Any thoughts or opinions on this as it stands? We're good. Everybody likes it. That's good. Nice, everybody. No, but like I said, there's no trick here. It's just sometimes people are like, oh, I didn't understand why I would have needed 3 accomplishment statements. In many cases, why are there 2? Why are there 3? Why isn't there an award section? Things of that nature. And you're not incorrect to have those questions, but ultimately this is what we're trying to do and trying to achieve in terms of the brevity of the document, and yet the document really relying on the exploration of our experiences and our professional skills as they've developed over time as the key component. So I think this is going to just zoom in a little bit here. And again, you can see just real clean. The accomplishment statements are to the point. They are broad in that you're not bringing me into the jargon or vernacular of your area of expertise, but I am getting a quick glimpse at your prowess and skill exhibited through these roles. And again, you'll get these slides later on. You also see, as you see in this leadership and mentoring experience section, some quantitative accomplishments that are brought forth. 75 students, 300 attendees, 12 fellows, so on and so forth. Numbers are a fickle thing when it comes to resumes. Numbers are very important. I think sometimes their importance is oversold, so people get really like frantic about finding all these numeric and quantitative components. I think the best way to identify numbers as a key element of the success of your written resume is trying to find rates of change over time. So when you're able to make comparisons, like this says, and this is a fine example, but it's just a way to kind of poke holes in an argument, is that if it says an event has 300 attendees, so what? Maybe you had a potential audience of 30,000 people and you only got 300. Maybe it's a bad rate. There are 43 people in this room right now. 84 signed up. What am I to take of that? There are I serve 4,200 students, and of those 4,200, 84 of them signed up, and 43 of them are here. What are numbers in that regard? But if I can look at those rates of change, it helps contextualize the numerics in a way where I can see impact over time. And that's one of the healthier ways of looking at quantitative achievement. That being said, qualitative achievement has just as much value. So if you helped create a process or a program or an initiative, that is the achievement. That is the victory. And so we just want to I want to make sure that we just bring attention to that, because again, in the conversations I had earlier today, a lot of people were like, I was told that numbers need to be on the resume. And there were some people that had them and they just weren't sure, like, why does this matter? And other people were like, I don't have them, therefore, oh no. And my reassurance is that and it's like cheeky advice I give, is like, they're good until they're not, right? And so they're helpful, but if they are without context and they don't help convey any type of clarity, then they're inherent problems. So we're gonna look at another sample. And again, just slight aesthetic differences largely. You see here that this is a little bit more straightforward in terms of the experience section being one major chunk. I do think this is risky because it really requires the reader to help understand any thematic ties that relate all of these experiences. But I don't think this is necessarily unto itself a problem. It is just a potential consequence of the setup. You can see also the professional skills section, which was not mentioned earlier. But if you are in a STEM field and you feel that your background in your STEM field is going to be relevant to the career that you want. So I think of people who are going into like biomedical research or pharmaceutical research or anything of that nature. They want to help reinforce their background with these particular tools. That professional skills section, depending on its relevance to what you want to do, it can float. So the highest it will float is under your education section. So I would lead with education still. Then it would be these professional skills, because if I need someone that has background in C++, MATLAB and Fortran, I need to see that. Otherwise, I'm going to stop reading. So otherwise, I'm wasting my time. And so this acts like a nice little tight summary. And again, if it's of relevance to the job, if you see in the job description they need evidence of that, it's probably best to just get that up there. Then, via your experiences, you would articulate how you used those tools in a real-time context. So you get to be a little redundant there, but it just acts as that nice tight summary. You see the relevant publications, again, the 2 out of total 4. That's a nice way to help shrink that section if that section is not of intense relevance to the job that you're looking to apply to. And you see the interest section on this version: sailing, scuba diving, automotive sports. If you're going to do something along those lines, just try to be particular. If you just say music and food, everybody likes music and food. What kind of food do you like? What kind of music do you do? If you like to travel, be a little bit more specific. Where are you going? What kind of places do you like to visit? I think it's just about, again, showcasing personality. And if we're like teasing it's just sort of benign. It doesn't really do much for us. Any questions, thoughts, opinions on this version? Or looking at one to the other, any need for clarification? And again, these are samples that are meant to just sort of more briefly touch on things. There are some things in here that I would, personally stay away from. But again, that's my personal aesthetic. There is an error here where you see Upton, New York, and the date. The date is above Upton, New York, and then all the rest of them, it's below. So that's on me. Sorry about that. But the idea here is just to be consistent. All right. Well, without further ado, we can certainly discuss these later.
I have a comment. Sorry, Brian.
Oh, it's okay. Erica, how are you?
Good. How are you, Brian?
Good, thank you.
So I've heard in some cases you want to write these statements in a way that you did something which led to something. Like what are the consequences of your work, has been used, what is like the practical applications and things like that. So in this particular one, I just noticed that it's more about just saying what the person did, but doesn't have that component of what the work led to, let's say.
Yeah.
So can you comment a little bit on that?
Yeah, this is admittedly an old sample that I think predated my even being here. So I will say it has a little lack of something to be desired. When you see like lead physics laboratories and the rest of the line is blank, I would definitely pounce on that. So it's an example to more like showcase format over content. But you're absolutely correct. What you're talking about is, and any of you who've worked with me in the past, I try to articulate the construction of accomplishment statements, which I do think is the next slide. And I'm just going to jump to it so we can talk about this. There we go. So the accomplishment statements are exactly what Eric was just mentioning. And it is sort of the culmination of what we did and how we did it and what was the impact of our work. And these are the exact questions that I ask people to ask themselves as they're writing this to confirm that what they've written is appropriate. So what I find, there are some tendencies in what I see when I look at resumes, and you'll look at this sample below as an example. So before it served as treasurer for a graduate school student organization, and that's just all it was. And it's like, okay, so what? Again, by just putting that, it's asking the reader to make any assumption or presumption about what your effectiveness was in the job. And they're never going to do that, because to hire you sight unseen like that would be risky. Like, well, they were the treasurer. I don't know if they were a good treasurer or a bad treasurer, or, again, a benign treasurer. Like, what did this person do as treasurer? What skills were conveyed through this? And so the after, you see, is a more thorough articulation, certainly, and a way to help convey your impact in the role. And that's what Erica was touching on. And that's one of the questions. Again, I'll go through these questions right now, but there are 4 questions I recommend people ask themselves when it comes to writing these accomplishment statements. So if we start with the before here, served as treasurer for a graduate school student organization, the questions to then help extrapolate this are how? So how did you serve? What does it mean to have served in this position? The how question, and I apologize for those of you that already heard me do this today or recently, the how question is to articulate methodological approach, because your method is different than my method, and that method is what is bringing you as a person, a personality, a unique individual into the fore. If I'm looking at 9 applications just next to one another, I'm going to see some redundancies, but the methodological approach is what helps elevate you. So that how question becomes very important. That's the first question. The second is using what. So we talked about some of those technical skills. If you're using QuickBooks to help keep track of the treasurer role, then that's in your budget, then that's fantastic. It just helps me understand that you have some basic understanding of how to leverage technology for the efficiency of your role. That unto itself is great, let alone if you're using, I don't know, pivot tables in Excel to help analyze data and I need you to use pivot tables. Well, now I know for a definitive fact that you've had past experience. That's using what. With whom is the third question. If you're collaborating with people, that's usually a good thing. People like that. If you're collaborating with colleagues across institutions, or you're collaborating with peers at this particular level, or the head of your department, or folks within the administration, those different types of collaboration showcase different types of personal engagements that you're capable of doing and managing, and that's important. And the last question, to finally underscore Erica's point, is to what extent? To what extent were you involved in the role? What was the impact of your work? And Erica, I love that you gave these quick different examples, and thank you again for volunteering. Is people see that word impact when I talk about it and they get real spooked because they think it means like this huge insurmountable task where you've revolutionized something. And I mean, my goodness, if you did that, congratulations, please talk about it. But the reality is, impact is quite varied and can be felt in many different ways. So if you helped bring forth an initiative with a group, that's the impact. If they helped propose new policies and piloted an improved outreach process, that's the impact. And as you can see in this after write-up, it includes both quantitative and qualitative ways by which to see and measure that impact. So this is where a lot of these details are severely important. Details that don't necessarily pertain to the job or the employer or the role itself, but details in terms of how we as individuals act, react, and adapt. It's very much an intensive personal experience of unpacking these prior roles that admittedly you may have not thought about in years, and require us to really dust off a lot of the details, and now also try to identify this impact, which again, I don't pretend is like a fun afternoon for people if you're exploring this for the first time. But it is a really essential and elemental one, because everything further that we will do in the job search process, submitting applications, writing cover letters, conducting informational interviews, conducting job interviews, all of this is predicated on the existence of what I call a professional narrative. That professional narrative is firmly composed of these accomplishment statements. These accomplishment statements, as you can imagine, include ample versatility and fluidity. So, being the treasurer for the grad school organization can convey your leadership skills, it can convey your quantitative skills, your budgetary skills, project management. Again, there's a lot of different ways we can try to pitch this. And that editorial fluidity by which you have is where some people become, let's say, concerned about misconstruing reality. And it's not so much that at all, it's that you are allowed the ability to retroactively look back on an experience and realize that it has this versatile component to it. I would say the same for life as a graduate student, right? Teaching classes, doing research, the colloquiums, the extracurriculars, they all have a certain level of fluidity. This isn't vocational school. So you're not only in this program to do one thing on earth. it does require us to sort of embrace that, believe it, acknowledge it, and then work on it in terms of how must we and how can we articulate those things. And that takes a little bit of time. That's why I look at this as an iterative process. This is something that we're going to try today. I'm going to have this narrative. I'm going to work on it some more. I'm going to talk to some other people. Based on what I've learned and the feedback I've gotten, I now have this modified narrative. And I'm going to keep moving forward because it's going to change, grow, and adapt as I move forward as well. So the person that I meet with from time to time who's like, I realized I needed a resume for the thing that's due tomorrow, and I whipped this together overnight. It's unstable ground. For better than nothing. I'm not gonna slam him for that. I do think it's a matter of you'd love to have this work done in real time, so that you don't need to feel that rush. Anyone in this workshop that feels rushed, you're going to be fine too. But I think the reality is we want to try to avoid that wherever possible. And it's just a matter of trying to progress forward as we can. So sorry about that. All right. So again, this is the narrative that we're trying to put together. This is the story of who we are in this professional context related to the job we're trying to apply to or the career we think we may want. And you can have a couple of ideas and a couple narratives even. That's perfectly fine. We talked about that fluidity already. But we want to realize that we want to put forth a cohesive narrative. And that's the retroactive component. Because I don't know about you, I won't say that the life I've lived to date I see as cohesive. Right? There's a lot of chaos in life. Sometimes we just do things, or we participate in things, or we embark on projects because today you felt like doing something. And when we're constructing the narrative, an elemental component of that narrative construction is to look back and to say, okay, well, what does all this say about me? What are the skills that I bring forth? What are the consistent behaviors that I exhibit? What do I look for in a project? What excites me? What challenges me? That's the cohesion we're talking about. And again, that doesn't come together in a day. But if you've just never started, now's as good a time as any. And we're trying to make that narrative relatable. We're trying to show that we can be a part of this larger institution, this organization, this employer, this program, this department, whatever it may be. We want to make sure that the people reading this document, if they're reading it for 30 seconds or 30 minutes, that they can come away from having looked at it and say, I now know more about Brian or whomever than I did before, and I want to continue the conversation. That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to appeal for a deeper conversation to be had. And this requires us, as part of this confidence building, is also the requirement of us taking ownership of these experiences. I need you to be confident, and I want you to use, the way I often say this very quickly is, you want to use active language, right? So again, a lot of we in academia, and for good reason, but I'm not hiring the whole team. I'm hiring you. So what did you do? What did you do as part of the team? You can celebrate that as well. But be confident in your role and your impact. And that does come with time, but we want you to take that ownership. Speaking of cohesion and narrative threads, the good way to kind of test this is, does this tell me, or does it help answer the tell me about yourself question, right? I won't say it's the dreaded question, but it's the question you can see coming a million miles away if you're in an informational interview or at a info session or an actual job interview. You know that question, some version of that question is going to be asked, and the resume should be sort of a summary answer to that question. So that's important. That's a good way to test where you're at. And again, you want to try to help the reader look at this document as a series of engagements. You developed and sort of leapfrogged or springboarded from, because everything's in reverse chronological order, right? So per section. So at the bottom of a given section, you had this role in a leadership position. And obviously that helped influence the other roles you would take. You're trying to showcase that development over time. And again, that adds to the cohesion narrative, certainly. But each experience is an opportunity for a deeper conversation. So there's a hook component of it. We're trying to kind of lure them in. We want them to ask more. We want there to be, and this is again, if you're worried about the writing and you're like, oh, I got to bring in all this detail, is that I really just need I need to know the most important things about you within your role. And then in the context of an interview, I can learn a little bit more about the details and the situation. That's a whole other conversation, right? You also want to make sure that you know what those are, because if you haven't investigated or thought about that experience in quite some time, it's just going to be clunky. No one's going to be good winging it. There's just too much on the line. So again, we talked about the 30 or 45-second keep piles. We want to make sure that if someone's only looking at it for a few seconds, less than a minute, we got to make sure that we get to the next developmental phase. So you want to think about it in terms of what that quickness looks like. So here you can see like the vertical read, you're looking in from the top left, and you're looking at the front loading of your strongest elements. And typically, the more recent thing we've done is usually the most expansive thing we've done. I mean, we need to ask ourselves, is that the case? And if not, maybe that allows for us to think about how we prioritize given experiences. Do we need to include everything that's here? Are there some things we should leave off as a result? For those of you that have been in the field longer, that becomes more of a possibility. For those of you who have 3-page resumes, that's a good possibility. It's a good position to be in. I always think too, people are reading left to right and they're going top to bottom. So glance down that document or ask people to look at yours and glance down the document. And are there takeaways? Are there things that stick with them? Because you're, again, trying to have that aesthetic appeal for the content relevant to the conversation. And again, this kind of jumps around, I apologize. But now, again, this is here. I wanted to show you some other resources that you can leverage currently. And that is on our website. This is ocs.yale.edu. And if you just hover over Get Prepared, you can go to Resumes, and you'll see resources for graduate students and postdocs. And I mean, the undergraduate stuff is helpful too for a lot of the basics, and we certainly cover those again. This is our tight, 3-minute CV to resume conversion video. If you haven't seen it, if you have a CV, if you're only working with a CV right now, again, it's sort of a different conversation of how to convert. Still touches on a lot of the elements we've discussed today, but this will help you kind of get on your way. There's a lot of opportunities to look at different samples for resumes. If some of the writing of the accomplishment statement seems confusing, you're not the first person who's come to us with that. A lot of opportunities for you to kind of delve into some resources here. And then just looking at those major differences between the CV and resume, again, for further investigation. But all that is right here for you to use. You're also welcome to continue the conversation with myself and my colleagues. We're always happy to work with folks and the development of resumes. That's a lot of what we do. Beyond that, we also have our online resume review process, where you can email a draft of your resume to ocs.resumereview@yale.edu. It will be reviewed via our resume writing rubric, which is also available on our website, and you'll get the resume with written feedback returned to you within 5 to 7 business days. And so if you're further along, you're like draft 2 or 3, and you're just like, I just need a little polish on this, I'd say the online resume review, and you have a little bit of time, the online resume review is a great tool. If you're just starting out, got a lot of questions, you want the feedback, I'd say come to the advising appointments. I think those will be best for you. And we're always happy to kind of walk folks through that process, because again, it's just everybody's had to go through it at some point, and that's kind of like the ties that bind us. So we're always happy to work with you on that and realize that it's part of the initial adventure of sort of determining who you are professionally, and it's sort of everyone's first step. I think there's a lot that can go into the process even before we begin the drafting of it, but I think sometimes it's best to just dive in and see what we think. So with that, that's the end of the presentation. I thank you all for joining me.